r/AskReddit. Nurses of psych wards. What did a patient do that left you speechless? My grandma has had Alzheimer's for a very long time, almost 10 years. Her and my grandfather were not married anymore. There was a lot of bad blood between them, and honestly my grandma was a bitch before manuscript and Alzheimer's destroyed who she was, but he came and lived with her to take care of her once the symptoms started showing up. He cared for her until he had a heart attack and had a defibrillator put into his chest. He couldn't care for her anymore. He refused to let her go into a home, but my dad and his sister made the difficult decision to go against his wishes. He stopped talking to any of my immediate family for around 6 years. Then, he got extremely sick and almost died. He recovered and was put into the same nursing home as my grandmother to start doing physical therapy and get his strength back. My grandmother always remembered him, and they would visit every day, and my grandfather would make her blush, calling her the prettiest gal he's seen despite her messy greasy hair and whiskers, holding her hand, and just sitting there staring at each other. Unfortunately, due to complications, he stopped breathing one night and passed away. My dad and aunt tried to break the news to her gently, and she began to cry and didn't stop for 2 hours. They eventually left, but when my dad went to see her the next day to check on her, she had forgotten. It was heartbreaking, but my dad decided the kindest thing to do was move on and not discuss my grandfather's death with her again. I've posted about some of these before, but here goes. I'm not a psychologist, but a former mental hospital patient. I'm depressive, but was in a closed psychiatric facility on 2 occasions. Once this was because I had myself committed, because I was suicidal, and once because there wasn't any space in any other kind of clinic. My roommate watched me brush my teeth on one occasion. While I'm doing this, I realize that he's staring at me. I try to ignore it. Then I realize he's staring at my toothbrush. He then tells me, "You shouldn't stick your lightsaber in your mouth." Okay then. There was a former soldier with PTSD that shared a room with me for a few days. I slept with earplugs during this time because he snored, so I only heard this story from fellow patients, and I'm not sure it wasn't exaggerated, but something close to it must have happened, because I did see the destruction afterward. Guy with PTSD can't sleep, so he goes to the duty nurse for sleep meds. Duty nurse at the time was a major asshole, not because she wouldn't give you meds if you asked. After all, she's more qualified than you to decide whether you should be given something or not, but because she treated you like an 8-year-old when you did ask, and not everyone in that facility had the mental faculties of an 8-year-old. Thank you very much. Anyways, she tells him that he can't have sleeping meds. He should try and sleep without them first. So the guy starts pacing up and down in the hallway. She comes and tells him that he needs to go sleep and that he's disturbing other patients, but he ignores her. She grabs him by the arm, and the guy completely flips, breaks the nurse's arm, and tosses her into a wall. Beats up 2 more hospital staff and 2 policemen that the hospital staff called to the scene. Then the head doctor of the station gets called in. He was off shift when this happened. Goes up to the guy telling him something about having a drink with an old comrade, and gives the guy one of those plastic medicine things that look like shot glasses with a massive dose of diazepine or some such. He drinks it and eventually keels over. Again, don't know if it actually went down like this, but I do know the nurse with the broken arm was fired for mistreatment of patients, and the hallway looked like it had been the site of a serious fight. The staff was cleaning bloodstains the next morning. The handrails had been ripped out of the wall, and another piece of drywall somewhere looked like someone had been thrown through it. I slept through the whole thing thanks to earplugs. There was one of those sliding fire gates that could be shut by pressing a button that could seal off part of the station, a part that was used for daytime activities and no one slept in. During the night, 2 manic patients were wandering around because they couldn't sleep, because that happens when you're manic, and one patient shut the other behind the fire door. The patient that was shut in started yelling "Help, help," in this really eerie voice that convinced other patients the place was haunted. One patient took out his dentures and put them in the dishwasher to clean them. When told that this wasn't a good idea, he cleaned them over the water fountain instead. Some of the Senna patients, when we were close to getting released, got permission to go watch a movie at the local theater. We came back home at 11 p.m. and as we walked in, someone made a really good joke, so we were all laughing our asses off. Night security guard sees us trying to get into the elevator and comes running. "What are you doing here?" "Me, we are patients from the psych ward." "Yeah." We ended up basically getting held by the security guard until some hospital staff came along and confirmed we said who we were. We had a lot of fun pretending to actually be insane in the meantime, asking the security guard whether it was normal to be hearing voices and telling him hotel service sucked in this place and whether this was an airport and at what time the next flight to Timbuktu would leave, etc, etc. I think he was glad to be rid of us at the end. The hospital staff was not amused, but then this wasn't the first thing like this, because a few of us eventually decided we are already in the nut house. This is our chance to do crazy stuff and get away with it, because everyone already thinks we are insane. Doctor later told me that this type of behavior is called cathartic mania, might not be the official term. I'm German. Hypomania and happens to a decent fraction of patients in the process of recovering from a depression. Basically means you show manic behavior for a short period after recovering from a depression, but this goes away pretty quickly. A different time we got to go out, someone else went and told the hospital staff afterward that I tried to jump in front of a bus. I did no such thing and was feeling well enough that I had absolutely no inclination to do so at the time. I still got 2 hours of one-on-one therapy with the head doctor, who kept telling me that they could only treat me if I was truthful with them. Blah, blah, blah. The other patient eventually admitted to lying. Luckily, a girl kept spitting water at me over dinner or splashing me with it. Eventually, I got fed up and dumped a carafe with several liters worth of water on her. Another patient is like, "Hey, wet t-shirt contest?" Staff was not amused because they had to clean up the mess. Someone dumped water into every bed on the station. Not a little bit of water either, but enough to soak them all. No one ever figured out who it was. I had the theory that this was because whoever had done it couldn't remember having done it and was therefore unable to give him/herself away. Went to step into some elevator at one point, was frantically waved off by a doctor standing inside. Standing inside with the doctor, I only got one glance as the elevator door closed, was someone who'd attempted to slit his throat, but bungled the attempt. From the amount of blood it looked to me like he should been lying on a stretcher. No idea what was actually going on there, but that image won't leave my mind in a hurry. Had a woman, married, 10 years older than me, and in there, because of postpartum depression, hit on me. It got so obnoxious that the doctors transferred her to a different ward so we wouldn't meet anymore. Edit. Added English translation for hypomania. Edit #2. Thank you for the silver anonymous donor. Not a nurse, but used to be a police officer. We got called to a psych ward where a guy was smashing up his room. Okay, fair enough. We got there, and the room was one where it had like plywood based furniture that was attached to the walls and floor. It had a solid door with an inch thick safety glass with wire in. He had ripped apart every bit of furniture apart from the bed with his bare hands, ripped the lights from the ceiling, ripped the sockets out of the walls. This is in the UK, so proper old brick and plaster walls, and had smashed a hole in the door window. He had absolutely no weapons in the room, and had done all this with his bare hands. I got there, and one of my colleagues was standing outside the door with a shield, and the patient was crashing into the door so hard that plaster dust was falling from the ceiling. He then managed to break through his window that led outside, also an inch thick, and got out onto the roof. They had to talk him down and eventually got him in, and a load of us escorted him to a room filled with only furniture and made from foam and padding, and the doctor gave him a powerful sedative and then quickly backed out the door whilst waiting for it to work. They took him to a psychiatric intensive care unit. I'll never forget the amount of damage he did. The room was sprayed with blood and looked like he'd smashed it up with a sledgehammer. He had only used his bare hands and the shitty furniture. That insane thing was he was about 5 feet 6 maximum and looked about 140 pounds maximum. He was a small man, but his psychotic break gave him insane superhuman strength. I had a patient that was a 26-year-old man. He was bipolar, schizoaffective with OCD and some mental delays. Come to the hospital. He also used heroin and meth frequently. He came up to the neuro floor on the 5th floor already in hard restraints because he was pulling at lines, swinging punches, screaming and threatening us. He was hallucinating and tried to cut out his own tongue because he said someone was making him say things he didn't mean. Absolutely no inhibition from this guy. I always prophylactically pulled Haldol and Zyprexa to have on hand, just for this special guy. If he didn't get what he wanted it, even if he simply didn't sleep well, he would literally go off. Each time we tried to bathe him, change him, give meds, he would thump against the bed frame or try to hit us. He was lewd and would try to masturbate all the time as well. He had endocarditis, infection of the heart valves, and had to have 4th antibiotics. He would literally pull his 4th like 3x a day. He finally got a central line in his neck and we also put padded mittens as well as restraint. His mother guilt tripped the doctor into telling me to remove his restraints one day. He totally was still tripping while the meds were being built up in his bloodstream. Of course, he took off down the hall screaming. He shoved people in the elevator and removed his central line in the elevator among MDs, RNs, and visitors. Security came and we had to literally apply pressure to his bleeding neck as the guards took each limb and carried him back to the room. He was there for like 2 weeks. The nice thing is they discontinued his heart monitor. I wonder why. And he went to MedSurg when the right pressures were applied. Psyche patients are everywhere. I've worked psyche and acute settings and it's actually worse at the hospitals. They are usually off their meds, had just attempted suicide, or harmed themselves, or are having a breakdown, or have medical problems on top of mental. It's the hospital that has to stabilize them and get them medically stable. In psyche, I actually had a lot of downtime and pretty lax days. When shit the fan, there are always people around to help. I was a tech at 3 different psych wards. I could tell you stories for days. But you asked what a patient did that left me speechless, so here's speechless. Despite being a psychiatric center, occasionally we'd get a medication management intake, which was basically someone with intellectual impairment, politically correct term for mentally retarded, who needed a safe place to transition through a change in their medication. Our newest patient was severely intellectually impaired. He was unable to communicate verbally, didn't hear very well, and also had severe visual impairment. His was one of the most severe cases I'd seen. Anyway, one of the things he did constantly was cross one arm across his waist, stick the fingers of his other hand into his mouth, and rock aggressively forward and backwards while standing. And he'd sucked his fingers so frequently that it had affected his teeth, and with such duration, that his arm was always glazed in saliva, which would froth up at the elbow and just sort of dangle there waiting for enough rocking to send it flying to the floor. This guy had spent his entire life in institutions, and he was about 18 or so when we got him. So it goes without saying that thumb-sucking liquid preventatives had all been tried on him, but our charge nurse went ahead and wasted her time attempting it. The truth of the matter from my perspective was he wasn't harming anyone and had very few comforts other than standing there rocking and sucking his thumb, so why make the poor guy's day any harder? Alas, he kept on slurping, even with his hand doused in that nasty stuff. Brace yourself. So he was on one-on-one observation during his time with us, which meant a staff member had to follow him around. Pretty easy since he just stood there rocking and keep him safe 24/7. But you were allowed to give the one-on-ones a little bit of privacy under certain conditions, if they had to use the bathroom. For this guy we actually put him on the toilet, so he could use the bathroom, and you guessed it, that meant cleaning him up. Oh, and I was his one-on-one that shift. Lucky me. Given his condition, it was okay to let him have moderate privacy, which entailed me standing by his bathroom door and the door being open just a crack. If it sounded like anything other than pissing or shitting was happening in there, I was only a few feet away. So I'm doing the mental math for how long I think a #2 takes, and I'm timing the process. Okay, now I can smell shit, so that means he's started. Another few minutes, and I'll peek in to see he's eating all of his shit. Completely hand over fist, shoving it in his mouth. Smeared on his clothes, arm, hands, the toilet seat. I told the charge nurse later, pretty sure I know why he didn't mind the taste of the thumb sucker stuff. Anyway, I have other stories. A close runner-up to most perplexing was the patient who was in the quiet room / timeout room, think padded room, naked because he'd torn his clothing up, and we confiscated it, and he refused to put on the tear-proof clothing we offered. Anyway, he peeled off his fingernails and shoved them in his urethra and had to receive medical assistance removing them. Not a nurse, but I worked in a group home for teens, and one ended up in a psych ward. She was a sweet 15-year-old girl who had been there for about 3 weeks. Plans for the future, would be staying with a relative she liked in a week, had friends, and had no history of issues whatsoever, aside from her mom kicking her out of the house for having a boyfriend, which she was understandably upset about. She went from sane to broken overnight. It was about 1 AM when I found her awake during checks, sitting on her bed and looking upset. She had become convinced she was pregnant, in spite of tests saying otherwise. Then the baby had been changed by chemicals. She was terrified of the baby inside her, and the chemicals everywhere changing everything. We couldn't seem to get her to realize she wasn't pregnant, couldn't be pregnant. And she would go on rants about chemicals, but it's hard to exactly what she was talking about. Cleaners? Pollution? Medication, which she wasn't on? She talked about chemicals getting in things the way some people talk about the devil. All strange, but still just borderline alarming. Then the clock started talking to her and telling her what to do, some of which involved burning herself and knocking her head against the wall. This is when we called authorities. She then basically became incoherent, in a word salad way, and was unresponsive to us, even when we got between her and the wall she was thumping. It was like we weren't there to her. When she was hauled away, about 4 hours after initial weird statements about how she was suddenly pregnant, she was in a kind of manic, but also oddly passive state, again, like we weren't there, and was unable to walk. She had to be carried out on a stretcher. She was mentally somewhere else entirely. It was terrifying watching herself collapse so quickly and completely. NSFW. This is very disgusting. Not a psych ward, but might as well have been. I was a corrections officer working nights. On a random Tuesday morning at around 3 AM we get a phone call that state police were bringing in a rowdy female. All available corrections officers meet the trooper in the garage. The young woman was screeching and yelling in the back of the police car. She was maybe 5 feet 5 inches 110 lbs. We opened the door and immediately she starts spitting on / at us. We get a spit mask on her and carry her into a holding cell kicking and screaming. We get her calmed down enough to remove the handcuffs and spit mask. After we close the door she strips naked and has a full-on shit in the middle of the floor. Without hesitation she picks up the shit and throws it at the window on the cell door. No biggie, seen this type of behavior before. Then she starts finger painting on the window. Stick figures. Eventually she gets bored with her artwork and explores the 8x8 cell further. She then decides to clean off her hands by licking them clean. Once she's cleaned herself she sits on the half wall that gives you privacy while using the toilet that she should have used earlier. Privacy wasn't her concern because she spread her legs and began diddling herself. By now everyone is past disgusted despite doing the job for many years and seeing it all. I stop watching at this point because my eyes have seen enough. Then I hear my coworker yell what the fuck. I look into the cell and she has her whole hand inside her vagina up to her wrist. She's moving her hand around inside and quickly removes it. She takes a second and looks at her hand then flings this disgusting substance that was green/yellow and had the consistency of gack or that Nickelodeon slime at the window next to the door. Sploosh. Thankfully she decided to go to bed right after. Day shift was understandably pissed off that the cell wasn't cleaned before their shift. The judge said that the report I wrote was the most disgusting thing he's ever read. Not a doctor or nurse, just a former patient. This was in a youth's psych ward in Germany, so it was also in the less serious, open, offener part of the facility, as opposed to the one for more serious cases which had like 3 locked doors in a row. Jesklesen. Generally there wasn't much dramatic stuff happening beyond some of the younger kids having freakouts and throwing toys around or something, and we had a guy once who was 17, and thus the oldest at the station, who just constantly went around being vaguely threatening to anyone who did something he didn't like. He was eventually gone. Rumors were he actually tried to do something and got picked up by the police. But who knows? Probably the weirdest two things I still remember. A guy once used his deodorant and a lighter he had hidden somewhere to light a fire on the end of a mop. The metal end, not the mop end. Don't ask me how that worked. He wasn't dangerous and pretty lucid, and I'm pretty sure it was less violent and insane and more dumb teenager stuff. But my first instinct was to act natural, and it happened while I was in the shower, so I could hear him doing it. So I just opened the cabin, wrapped myself in a towel and casually walked past him while he was fucking wielding a homemade torch, and I just said hey, nice, because I didn't know what else to say and was also super nervous. There wasn't anything flammable in there, and the exit was in full view of the nurse's room, so it's not like he could have done anything harmful, but still. He apparently ended up putting it out with the help of another guy later, and none of the nurses caught wind of it. Whenever we went out in groups, usually with a nurse, but sometimes without, there was always a part of the group that loudly touted around the fact that, hey, did you know, we're coming here from the psych ward, OOOH spooky? And it was amazing watching the nurses being completely exasperated and annoyed, half the patients slink away in embarrassment and the other half laughing their asses off, while the people around us were completely baffled. The funny thing is that this group always existed. I was in there multiple times and over long periods, but there were always a handful of people who did this exact same thing. Haha. Escapes were numerous and a weirdly casual thing. One time a girl tried to escape, got all the way to the train station, and tried to call someone on a public phone. And according to the nurse, well, I tapped her on the shoulder and she just went, oh man, are we gonna go back? And then we went back. The nurses were generally pretty friendly. It was more the doctors and psychiatrists / therapists that were giant assholes from time to time. So about an hour after we realized she was gone and saw one of the nurses sprinting out the exit door at full speed, we just saw her come back in together with the nurse, and the two were just casually talking and laughing while the nurse locked the door again. Unless the patient was actually violent, in which case this would have been the wrong ward anyway. This was usually how escape attempts went down. That same girl was also once picked off of a fence like an apple when she tried to climb over and got stuck. Electric devices were completely forbidden if they had any internet capability at all, so you could bring in maybe an MP3 player at best. Drugs, alcohol and similar stuff was also forbidden, for obvious reasons. And the nurses were usually quite thorough at searching your belongings when you came in or came back from a trip to the city or something. However, we once got a new patient, which happened about once or twice a week, and everything first went as usual. About 2 hours later, we were all sent to our rooms and told not to come out until the situation is resolved. The situation, as I later unofficially found out from one of the nurses, was that the girls apparently managed to not only smuggle in marijuana, I think, but also an entire fucking laptop without being noticed. How do you not notice a fucking laptop in someone's bag? How would you even hide that? Throw away because I was a patient. Suicide attempt. I'm better now. I was hospitalized, adolescent, once for an attempt in high school. Nothing too remarkable other than a girl who shaved off her eyebrows. And a lot of the patients tried to get involved with one another. 2 summers ago, however, I was put in the adult ward at a hospital in New York City. It was an interesting mix of people who were coming down from drug addictions. They were zombies due to the meds they had them on. Homeless people who had been caught up in some nondescript shit. A couple of young men who were placed there to be monitored instead of taken to jail / lockup. And various characters who did things like shit their legs or wipe fezzes in other people's rooms during breaks. The most memorable for me was this elderly, blind, Jewish, hold on, man. He used to be a radio DJ, and that's about all he would talk about. Other than when he was running down the halls, endlessly screaming all night long, calling women disparaging names, telling various people that they sounded like N-words, etc. He spent a lot of time in solitary. He would use the phones and pretend to call people, but there was never anyone else on the line. Well, he would pretend to call a woman and switch between calling her awful anti-Semitic things to phone sex and everything in between. The most memorable line for me was when he talked about UHG. Just shuddered reliving this. Eating her out and how she was nasty because she smelled like gefilte fish. In the end, the patients rebelled. Almost everyone on the ward filed an official complaint asking to have him moved somewhere else. So happy ending, he was removed. I also got reintroduced to AA due to a kickers group that would come in and hold meetings a few times a week for patients. Ended up not gelling with them character wise on the outside, but grateful for it. So I'm over 1.5 years sober now, have a kickers job, apartment, health, and savings again. Edit. Oh, one more. There was a middle-aged guy who kept to himself and shared in meetings that he'd spent most of his life in prison, more than once shared that he trusted no one and he'd kill anyone if he felt threatened. He was really well spoken, seemed to enjoy reading, and mentioned Scrabble once. So I invited him to start playing and we got a bunch of games under our belt before I got released. I gave him my contact info so we could keep in touch and play on the Scrabble app. I googled him after my release. He had been incarcerated for obsessively stalking and assaulting women who turned out to be similar in age and background to myself. When I read that, I felt like I'd been dunked in ice water. When I was working EMS, got called to an attempted suicide by hanging. When we arrived, PD was on scene with a large woman who had wrapped an extension cord around her neck and was pulling on either end to try to choke herself. Well, we took that away and loaded her up. At the time we were stationed at a rural hospital without a dedicated psych unit, so we have to transport her around 40 miles to the hospital where her doctors are. This is where things started getting interesting. Of course, it's my turn to take the call to my partner's undying joy, so I load up and back, get the lady's vitals, and begin working on my report. Since I've got a decent ride ahead of me, and there's not much a medic can do with a psych patient except talk, and she wanted none of that. So, I'm sitting in the captain's chair, which is located behind the head of the stretcher, when the patient starts reaching up to try to open the cabinets next to her. I ask her not to do that and she complies for around 30 seconds when she promptly starts at it again. After several iterations of back and forth asking her not to do that, I inform her if she does not stop I'll have to restrain her. This seems to do the trick. Now, the head of the stretcher was elevated to allow her to sit upright, so I can't see everything she's doing from my position, but I notice she's tossing and moving subtly to try to avoid detection. As I peer around, this large woman, probably pushing 300 pounds, has pulled her shirt over her head to allow her brawler smell and sized breasts free, and is giving quite the show to the people currently following us on the interstate. I quickly inform her that is unacceptable and get her to pull her shirt down and cover her up with a blanket to cut the show short. We are not even halfway to her hospital yet. Luckily the rest of the ride is rather uneventful until we near the end of our journey. About 10 minutes out from our destination, I once again notice her trying to stealthily conceal her movements. I quickly get up to see what she's doing, and I was literally flabbergasted. I stand up just in time to see her rip a soiled maxi pad from her pants, and in this moment my life stood still. My brain is racing with possibilities of what she might do with said maxi pad and the host of reactions that may occur as a result. I tell her very sternly to put the pad down, like a cop telling someone to lower a weapon. She complies hesitantly and a slight bit disappointed as we're pulling into the air. Relieved to finally be at our destination, I hop out to my chuckling partner and we roll our patient in. Unfortunately we have to wait because the air is full. As we wait, I'm giving my report to the receiving nurses, all of whom are now thoroughly amused by my plight, and as I turn around to ask my patient a question, she promptly grabs the maxi pad, which I had failed to take away from her, my mistake, and slaps it on her forehead soiled side out. At this point, I look at my partner, put my hands up and walk away. I'm not a nurse, but was a patient. When I was younger I was extremely suicidal and went to a psyche ward for a 72-hour watch. Problem is, place I went didn't separate patients based on condition, and the age difference between patients was 8 years. I was 14, and a day in, we had a 9-year-old come in. He probably had schizophrenia because his name changed every day, and he told us stories of how his mom and dad stabbed him 80 times with glass. He pulled up his shirt to show quote scars, but there were none. None of that mattered to me, as I was more concerned with my miserable life. But the thing I'll never forget, ever, is what he did on the second day. All morning, he had been telling the nurses he was going to kill himself after lunch, but they just ignored him. I wish I could find those nurses today. I'd had some strong words. They didn't do anything about it, just ignored him. Come lunch, he's crying, screaming about how he's going to end it all, and the staff still ignores him. We went to our back open hour, which was just a yard surrounded by brick, and this kid runs past me bawling, then goes by the nurses and bangs his head as hard as he could on the brick wall. He was down for a second or two, then gets up. I'll never forget that sound. He broke his nose doing it. There was blood everywhere. The staff finally starts to walk over, and this kid gets up again and starts banging his head repeatedly. It gets harder and harder. After about 10 hits, he collapses and the nurses take him in. They had been trying to stop him, but there was no real effort. There was blood everywhere as they took him in, and all the other kids, myself included, were just screaming. I cried harder than I had in my life that day. He reminded me so much of my brother. They were the same age, they looked so alike. I still sometimes cry at night, and I'm not one to express emotion. I can still hear the crack of his nose on the wall. I can still see the blood dripping from his head. Whenever I'm with my brother, I'm on edge, ready to jump in if he starts hurting himself. I still hate those nurses. Not a nurse, but I worked as a CNA in a nursing home that had no business caring for residents with advanced dementia or Alzheimer's. This resident's insurance unfortunately wouldn't allow her to go somewhere better, and the family would ignore our requests to move her to a facility that was better for her. She definitely had really bad dementia and was particularly tricky because she had a colostomy bag that needed to be checked/changed several times a day. For some reason that we could never figure out, she would walk all day, every day. Sometimes she would walk for 12 hours straight up and down the halls. We could redirect her occasionally by holding her hand and walking for a bit and somewhat guiding her to her room, but she would walk back out as soon as we left. The only way to get her to go to the bathroom for us to change her colostomy